Hello, hello. This is Dr. Z. Zachary Brooks. This is part of the Culture, Cognition, and Change series. I originally did this week-long series of presentations in Mexico at la Universidad Popular Autónoma del Estado de Puebla. It's also known as UPAEP. So the University of California, Los Angeles is usually known as UCLA. La Universidad Popular Autónoma del Estado de Puebla is usually known as UPAEP, so that's where that comes from. And I was invited to give a series of talks, and I named those talks Culture, Cognition, and Change. Day 1, I did intercultural competence. Day 2, I did brain and language. I was asked to record things at the time, which I did, but subsequently you hear the recording. The recording quality was good, but there was a lot of interference with questions and just ambient noise. So then someone asked, could I actually just re-record it in a quieter space and time, which I'm doing today. And this is part 3 of 3, so 3 parts of 3 for the brain and language conversation and talk I gave to students at Universidad Popular Autónoma del Estado de Puebla, UPAEP, in October 2018. So if you followed along so far, let's just get right to it as quickly as we can. So culture, cognition, and change. The 3 C's, Dr. Z. This is part 3 of 3. And we're talking about brain and language, originally given October 16th and 17th, 2018. And here's the image of the brain we see now in these slides. And it's a pretty cool image to see the brain and all of its gray matter. So let's continue with different research that's been done on brain and language. The first 2 we did in part 2 were very much brain research. And this next 2 we're going to look at are more behavioral, so less invasive ways to look at brain. So you can kind of look at the brain through behavior and just how people act, or you can really study the brain directly. So we've already kind of looked at the brain directly. Now let's look at the brain less directly through behavioral research. So we have a researcher in Canada. A researcher is named Debra Jerrod with other colleagues, and she looked at picture naming and culturally congruent images. And the thing about the next 2 things are actually looking at things related to bilingualism and second language acquisition. The first 2 were just looking at the brain generally. These actually are more specifically looking at bilingualism and second language acquisition. So here's Debra Jerrod at the University of Western Ontario. Looks like a beautiful place. This was probably taken on a gorgeous day in the fall at the University of Western Ontario. So the method that Dr. Debra Jerrod used with her colleagues was to take Mandarin English bilinguals and have them complete a picture naming task to test the dual coding theory. The dual coding theory is that when 2 languages are learned at different times and in different contexts, some images may be more strongly associated with one language than the other. So she's looking at pictures, basically, and some pictures have a certain cultural context. And if you compare Mandarin to Canadian cultural context, you can imagine they're quite different. Canadian is very much associated with North American and American images in English, and obviously Chinese is associated with the Asian continent and so forth. So very different cultural contexts. You can imagine that pretty easily. So the prediction that the researchers had was that the pictures from Chinese culture should be named more quickly in Mandarin than English because the connections are stronger to the first language, and so are the images. So there's different cognitive things going on. Language and images are connected more to a first language cultural context. There were a total of 40 participants, and each of these participants saw 88 images. Some were more Mandarin Chinese related images, some were Canadian English images. So here's how the setup for participants worked. So participants, represented by this boy pointing at images, were shown different images. So what the images that are being shown, if you're listening to this online, are 2 images of mailboxes. So there's a mailbox that's green, thin, cylindrical, with Chinese lettering, but that's a mailbox. And then there's an image of a mailbox which is Canadian, sort of square, red with a typical Canadian red color. And both of those are mailboxes, but one's in a Chinese cultural context, the other is in a Canadian cultural context. The second set of images are bird cages. So we have a bird cage that's very much more of a Chinese-looking bird cage. Looks like it's made of some sort of wood or wicker. The other one is a Canadian bird cage made out of some sort of metal, and just the coloring as well is different. We have different images of cabbage. So we have a Chinese cabbage, which is more thin and long, and the other one is sort of round, like a soccer ball, and that's more of a Canadian cabbage. And the next one is a mask. We have a mask that's very typically Chinese, and the other one is Canadian, which are probably associated with like medieval European mask types. And I've listed then in words, mailbox, we have different images, just as an example: mailbox, birdcage, cabbage, and mask. And these are the images that participants saw. And these are, again, bilingual speakers who speak Chinese Mandarin and Canadian English. The results. So the pictures from the Chinese culture were named more quickly than pictures from English Canadian culture. This is what the authors thought might happen, and when they tested it, that is what happened. Pictures from English Canadian culture were named more quickly than pictures from Chinese culture. So there's these very clear associations when we're learning a second language or when we speak multiple languages, where certain images, in this case, are associated with languages much more readily. And that's kind of fascinating. It means that when we're learning a language, we're not only learning the language, we're learning lots of cultural images and other things, and then we associate languages with certain images much more quickly. So this probably means that there's lexical representations for the two languages that can be different. So even though we have one brain for any language we speak, for all languages we speak, the representations can be different, which is pretty interesting. So that's the end of the Jerrod study from 2013 and her colleagues. So let's go back to the connection between punk rock music and dance music. Don't always work as you wish, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. 1978, here's what we have from the Joy Division. So probably at this point you can hear it does have that sort of punk sound that you heard in the two previous samples, but there's something that kind of changes a little bit at that point. Something that kind of changes. If you're a music person, you know exactly what changed. If you're not, you still have ears, and you can notice there is a subtle change between those previous two samples. So we'll pick that up in a few minutes, but now back to research. So second language reading in Spanish. So this is by Inken and her colleagues. I'm, in full disclosure, was one of those colleagues. This work we did a couple years ago was finally published in 2017. Liz Inken, Dr. Liz Inken, is a professor at the University of Nebraska. So if you're not from the United States, Nebraska is next to Iowa, and it's actually close to Kansas and also Missouri. So it's really in the middle of the United States. Very good university. So Lincoln and her colleagues wanted to look at second language readers and see how they might differ from first language readers, so people who read Spanish as a first language and people who read Spanish as a second language. So the method, there was 26 people who read Spanish altogether. 16 were beginning level and 10 were advanced level. So that means 7 were native speakers of Spanish and 3 were non-native, but they were had many, many years of speaking and reading Spanish, and they behave very similarly to people who read Spanish as a first language. Sometimes just as good because they actually have read more Spanish at some level because they've really focused on it. So all of these subjects, the 26 subjects, read 24 sentences. In fact, 48 sentences, but in the 24 sentences, only one word was changed. And the word that was changed became either a high-frequency word or a low-frequency word. So I'll show the examples on the next slide of the high and low frequency word. This is all in Spanish. So the high frequency word, the sentences are the same except for the one word change. So the high frequency word in the first sentence is normalmente al chico le gusta la lluvia, pero hoy tiene frío. The low frequency word in the second sentence is normalmente al chico le gusta la nieve, pero hoy tiene frío. So the word difference is la lluvia versus la nieve. So la lluvia is rain versus la nieve is snow. Now, maybe if you're in the northern part of the United States or Canada, let's say, where there's lots of snow, snow is very frequent. But this study was conducted in Arizona, where there's very, very little snow, but where there is a lot of rain. So in this case, there's an ecological validity to using both of these words, and both of these words came from a database, and the database just lists the frequency of the words, in Spanish in this case. So the results, back to punk rock and some sampling. So now the first three samples were from 1976, 77, 78. And now we're going to have 1980, 1985, and 1989. And this is where you probably should hear the transition the most between punk rock music and dance music. So the first sample is 1980, Joy Division, which we heard in the last slide about punk rock. And we'll just listen to a few seconds of their sound. So, by the way, this is all for educational purposes in this case. Thanks for letting me use this, and hopefully it's okay I use this because it's just for educational purposes. So we go from Joy Division 1980 to New Order. So Joy Division became New Order after one of their members passed away in 1980. So then the band reformed and then had a new sound about 5 years later. So let's find where I can play that. All right, let's go to... Nope. Around here. So at this point, we probably should hear a difference between 1980 and 1985, significant difference, but there's still some things that should sound familiar. So there's a rapid sequence of sounds, and it's a very regular rapid sequence of sounds that we have in 1980 and 1985. So that's still very much a sort of a punk rock sound, but now we have some different instrumentation, more electronic influences in 1985 music. 1989, the end of the decade, now we're going from, again, punk rock to dance, and at this point, some of the dance music influences are going to be more obvious. So at that point, it should be more obvious how this music is transitioning from punk to, very 80s, what we associate with 80s music, some instrumentation, some electronic music, to something now resembling a little bit more like dance music we're more comfortable or more used to hearing these days, 2018. So let's continue with the brain and language conversation. So brain and language, day 2. So this is what I did on day 2. For you, it could be day 2 or day 20, however long it's taken to listen to this. So some questions. So I have a little quiz. So the frontal lobe is responsible for what? What is the frontal lobe responsible for? Is it number 1, judgment, planning, problem solving? Number 2, interpreting language and words? Number 3, interpreting vision? Or number 4, understanding language? So if you answered number 1, judgment, planning, problem solving, you are correct. So the frontal lobe is responsible for judgment, planning, and problem solving. Next slide, question 2. The parietal lobe is responsible for judgment, planning, problem solving, interpreting language and words, interpreting vision, or understanding language. The answer is number 2, interpreting language and words. Next slide, question 3. The occipital lobe is responsible for number 1, judgment, planning, interpreting language, number 3, interpreting vision, or number 4, understanding language. And you probably can guess the answer is interpreting vision, color, light, and movement. Question number 4. The left hemisphere is responsible for which of the two? Speech, comprehension, math, writing, or creativity, spatial ability, artistic skills, musical skills? The answer is speech, comprehension, math, and writing. Question number 6. The right hemisphere is responsible for which of the two? Speech, comprehension, math, writing, or number 2, creativity, spatial ability, artistic skills, musical skills? The answer is number 2. The right hemisphere is responsible for creativity, spatial ability, artistic skills, and musical skills. Question number 7. Which part connects the left and right hemispheres? Is it called the cerebellum, number 1, the centrum, number 2, or the corpus callosum, number 3? The answer is the cerebellum. No, excuse me, the corpus callosum. I made a mistake. So if you're looking at this online, it's number 3. I put my animation in the wrong spot. That is my mistake. The correct answer is corpus callosum. All right. Question number 8. Who is tan or ton in French? Number 1, operating in an environment where everyone is from the same culture. The man who had a brain injury could only say the word ton, ton. Or the man who had a brain injury and could only understand ton, ton in German and French. So the answer is number 2, the man who had a brain injury and who could only say the word ton. And he was studied by Broca, a French doctor. Question number 9. How would you summarize modularity and integrated about the brain? So we've talked about modularity a lot, integrated less, but modularity is what? So how would we summarize modularity and integrated? So we have 3 possibilities, and immediately, by the magic of animations, the correct answer comes up and is underlined. Modularity refers to the idea that there are distinct and separate brain regions that have specific functions for language. And integrated networks refers to the idea that multiple brain regions coordinate for language. So, okay, that's the end of our quiz on brain and language. Now let's get back to the punk rock conversation and how punk rock now has evolved to dance music. And let's listen to a sample from 1998. So this is a sample 10 years later after the last one we heard. So now we definitely hear dance music. 1998, this is 20 years ago, Ibiza. I happened to be in Ibiza in 1998. A lot of fun. If you were there in 2018, I'm sure it's also a lot of fun. It's a great place to go enjoy yourself, party, do whatever kind of fun stuff you want to. So that's music from 1988, and hopefully, slowly, you're now hearing the connections between punk rock and dance, especially in that slide 2 where we went from 1980 to 1989. 2008, what happened in 2008? What kind of music are we listening to then? Dave Seaman has some sort of funk to it with some accents he's doing on top of the bassline beats. And finally, 2018, Nick Warren, slower beat, very much dance, progressive house type music, and so forth. So now we've heard the connection ourselves between punk rock and dance music. Dance music is used as a huge general term. So let's go back to a conversation about brain and language, now that we've talked about punk rock music and dance music quite a bit. So back to what we talked about earlier. So Dr. Binder and his team studied which of the following. So now we have another little quiz. Which of the following did Dr. Binder and his team study? The activation of the brain during tones and rest, the activation in the brain while participants heard either tones, rest, or words, the activation in the brain while participants heard tones and words together, the activation in the brain while participants heard tones and words together while watching an fMRI machine. So the correct answer is number 2. So Dr. Binder studied activation of the brain while participants heard either tones, rest, or words. What they found, if you recall, is that when they heard tones, the entire brain lights up. When they heard language, only the left hemisphere of the brain lights up. Next question. Question 2. Professor Sophie Scott and her team of researchers in London studied the temporal lobe using which combination of methods? Number 1, unpigmented speech, noise vocoded speech, which sounds like a harsh whisper, and unintelligible speech, which was actually a sound file that had been flipped. Number 2, noise vocoded speech, which sounds like a harsh whisper, and unintelligible speech, which was actually a sound file that had been flipped. Or number 3, unprocessed speech, like normal speech, noise vocoded speech, which sounds like a harsh whisper, and unintelligible speech, which actually is a sound file that had been flipped. So which is the correct answer? Number 3. So they used unprocessed speech, noise vocoded speech, and unintelligible speech, which is actually a sound file that had been flipped. Question number 3. Dr. Debra Jerrod and her team of researchers in Canada used picture naming to study visual lexical representations of Mandarin English bilingual speakers. What did they find? Pictures from Chinese culture were named more quickly than pictures from English Canadian culture. Pictures from Chinese culture were named more slowly than pictures from English Canadian cultures. Pictures from Chinese culture were named as quickly as pictures from English Canadian culture. The correct answer is the number 1. Pictures from Chinese culture were named more quickly than pictures from English Canadian culture, because we have our first and our second language, and we not only associated new words with that second language, but also some pictures. In this case, she showed iconic Mandarin pictures, such as a mailbox, or an iconic Canadian picture, such as a mailbox in Canada. Next question. Dr. Liz Inkin and her team of researchers studied L2 Spanish speakers reading by using eye tracking. What results did they find? Number 1, all readers showed slowing with lower frequency words, but beginning readers showed a slowing effect in the next 5 words, while advanced readers only showed a slowing effect in the next 2 words. Number 2, all readers showed slowing with low frequency words, but beginning readers showed a speeding effect in the next word to compensate for going slower. Number 3, all readers showed slowing with low frequency words, but beginning readers showed a slowing effect in the next word, while advanced speakers did not slow down after a low frequency word. The correct answer is number 3. All readers have a similar pattern when it comes to low frequency words, but advanced readers, they continue reading normally after that low frequency word, whereas second language readers, they'll continue to slow down after a low frequency word. It's like walking along the street, tripping on a pebble. You don't actually trip the moment you go over a pebble or a rock. It's the next step, and that's what second language speakers are doing. Next question. Dr. Binder and his team studying tones and semantics, or words, found which of the following? Number 1, tones exhibited bilateral processing and words exhibited left lateral processing. Number 1. Number 2, tones exhibited bilateral processing and words exhibited right lateral language processing. Number 3, tones exhibited left lateral processing and words exhibited bilateral language processing. Which is correct? Number 1, tones all over the brain, bilateral, words left lateral. Next, number 6, Dr. Scott and her team studied temporal lobe using clear speech and modified speech. What did they find? Number 1, the left temporal lobe responds to all phonetic information. Number 2, the left temporal lobe responds to all phonetic information, but the posterior part responds if the phonetic information is recognizable. Number 3, the left temporal lobe responds to all phonetic information. The posterior portion responds to the phonetic information that is recognizable. The anterior portion responds to phonetic information that is intelligible. Which one is correct? Number 3, right? That part of the brain responds to any language, even if you don't understand it. You understand things as human language, even if you don't know that language. But only when it's intelligible does the front part, the anterior part of that lobe respond. Next, question 7. Dr. Scott and her team found that the left temporal lobe responds to all phonetic information. The posterior portion responds to phonetic information that is recognizable. The inferior portion responds to phonetic information that is intelligible. So how could this finding be related to a new language? Number 1, learning a new language is difficult. This disproves it. Learning a new language means that the brain has to work extra hard, and now there is evidence. Number 3, second language learners' temporal lobes may activate more during recognizable speech and less during intelligible speech when they begin learning before their temporal lobes exhibit that more of the new language is intelligible. Number 4, the temporal lobes of second language speakers are different than the temporal lobes of first language speakers. Hopefully you know the correct answer is number 3. Maybe second language speakers are activating and recognizing language as they're learning it, and as they get better, more of that language becomes actually intelligible, language that they can actually communicate and use. Next slide. So which of the bands listed as a band during the discussion of the connection between punk rock and dance music? So which band is the one that's listed as a connection? Joy Division, Sex Pistols, Warsaw, New Order, Happy Monday. In fact, all of these bands were mentioned during the conversation about the connection between punk and dance music. Number 9, this is not Liz Inken, this picture, so there was a mistake by me again. Oh well. Hopefully you've followed along so far so well. In the eye-tracking research by Liz Inken and her colleagues, they used low and high frequency words and sentence pairs. How did they determine which words were low frequency and which ones were high frequency? Number 1, they used a Spanish corpus of words. Number 2, they used an English corpus of words and translated them into Spanish. Number 3, they discussed among themselves and decided based on the sentence context which words would be high frequency and which ones would be low frequency. The answer is they used a Spanish corpus of words. What's a corpus? It's a database of words. So you look in a database, the database, if you look up the word the, in this case el or la, it'll be very high frequent. Any other word, it can be lower in frequency than those kind of words. And finally, Dr. Bender practices and researches the brain in which American state? Wyoming, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, or Michigan? The answer is Wisconsin. This brings us to the end of the brain and language discussion I originally had in Mexico at UPAEP in October 2018. The time I gave it, it was well received by the teachers who are going to be teaching English as a second language to Mexican students. And they asked me if I could reproduce this because the sound quality I made during the presentation, while good, wasn't good enough. And I'm not, I've shared this a few times, not a brain and language expert. There's lots of other people who do much better. You can take classes in a community college, online. There's lots of people. If you're interested in this stuff, just, delve into it further. My goal is to give people an introduction to brain and language, especially people who want to teach brain and language or teach English or teach another language as a second language. They have some basic understanding of the brain. So thanks again and have a good day. And until next time, happy deciding. Question number one are that all readers, native and advanced versus the beginning level readers, they showed a slowing with the low frequency words. So when they're reading the sentence, and they see the low frequency word, in this case snow or la nieve, they all slowed down. The difference is that beginning readers showed residual slowing, meaning they came across that low frequency word and then they continued to be slow after that low frequency word, whereas advanced readers continued normally as if they had never read a low frequency word. So that was a big difference found in this particular research. So it's also research related to brain and language. It's not, studying the brain, directly, but it's a measure of the brain, and it shows that there are differences between first and second language, in this case, readers. So that's the fourth of four sample research for second language brain stuff. So